Good evening. I'm Greg Martineau, Assistant Superintendent, and on behalf of the Public Schools of Northborough and Southborough, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Speaker Series event. This evening, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Kathleen Howland, who will be presenting How Science Informs the Importance of Music Education. Dr. Howland is both a speech and language pathologist, a music therapist, and a music education advocate. For over 35 years, she has worked with a variety of clinical populations across the lifespan, using music to enhance speech, language, cognition, and movement, and habilitation and rehabilitation settings. She is committed to bridging the communities of science and art in order to identify best practices. She is intense, a lover of animals, passionate and curious about the ways that music can transform brain form and function. She filmed a TEDx talk entitled How Music Can Heal Our Brain and Heart that has been seen over by 60,000 viewers. She is the founder of Music Therapy Tales, which collects clinical stories about the beauty and potential power of music in addressing a wide variety of diseases and disorders. She is a resident of Northborough and the education director of the annual Solar Jazz Festival held in Northborough, our Northborough community. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Kathleen Howland.
Thanks, Greg. Well, good evening, neighbors. It's really nice to be able to be here. I've been looking forward to this event. I understand there's some music educators in the audience. Is that so? Wonderful, wonderful. It's really good to be part of the tribe and then to have us all take a look at how important and how noble your work is in the school district. So my agenda tonight is to really distinguish what are innate characteristics of music in the human condition and those that are trained. And it's the age-old argument of nature versus nurture that is getting a huge amount of attention in neuroscience for the past nearly 20 years. And then looking at the importance of music across the lifespan, I think it has a lot to say about its place in our human condition. And to look not only at the musical benefits of training, but especially the non-musical benefits from music training. So when we look at those traits that we're born with, actually the brain of a fetus is a remarkable auditory perceiver. It perceives patterns. It is able to perceive interruptions in patterns, which neuroscience calls an expectancy violation. So if I was to sing A, B, C, D, E, F, right, there's an expectancy violation, something that's compelling. And actually we see responses, not motor responses like you just gave me, but we see responses in fetuses and in infants. When we look at an expectancy violation in this film, what you'll see is a child who's not quite a year, a furniture walker, and actually will be supplying the pitch for an expectancy violated song that's familiar.
Okay, let's do our peekaboo. Ready? Ya-da-dum, ya-da-dum, ya-da-da-da-dum. Pika, 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 pika. Ya-da-dum, ya-da-dum, ya-da-da-da-dum. Pika, 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 pika.
Okay, so this child is probably anywhere from 6 to 12 months away from actually vocalizing or verbalizing their first words, but is able to organize respiration and phonation to match a pitch that he knows should be there, and has been left out. So the ability for us to actually harvest children's responses beyond motor responses has really been key to understanding what they're capable of. Entrainment is another one of those elements that is of utmost importance and really one of the most powerful indications of music abilities that we have. With a sleeping newborn infant that has got like an EEG on them. If you were to do a pattern, at that missing element, the sleeping baby's brain would spike, recognizing that something was missing. And this also has come to show us that we don't have to teach somebody where the beat is in music. And when I asked my Berkeley students, how would you teach somebody where the beat is, where is it not, they are really stumped. So for a $250,000 degree in music, they cannot explain where the beat is in music. It's because it's something that we're born with knowing. It's not something that's trained or taught. And so it's very difficult to figure that out. We also know that in fetuses that they will discriminate familiar songs versus novel songs and respond accordingly with heart rate changes, facial grimacing, as well as movement. So the patterns of sound are very much a part of the last trimester of the womb, and it's influencing brain development. So children are born with tremendous capacities for auditory perception. Now here's a sense of entrainment. If I asked you to clap along to the beat with me, please do that. Good. I hid my hands so that there was no visual cue. And how many claps do you have to listen to in order to entrain with it? 2. That's because our brains are feed forward. They actually are predicting what happens next and moving to that. And you'll see a couple films here. This little bobblehead child, as you see, very young, very poor trunk control, just now sitting up. And what you'll see is a reaction to his father, who uses pitch to say, "You want my beatbox?" And you'll see, like all children do, their eyebrows go way up, and that he stops breathing a little bit because all his attention is going to the pitch changes in speech that are really important for learning language. And then his father will start a beat and he will move to that.
Trying to tell me something?
There go the eyebrows.
You want to dance? Dance, 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 dance. Dance my beatbox? Good job. Yeah. Yeah.
So the music stops, and he doesn't need to be looking at his dad, just like the first child didn't need to be looking and being attentive. He's moving around as a child should and would, and yet the ears are always on. And so this child, as soon as that rhythm stopped, even though he was looking afar, his movement stopped. So we've had sort of these anecdotal type of films before because we always required movement to show us what the brain was able to do. But now with neuroscience and the imaging capacities, we're actually able to see what a child knows is that we move to music, this is where the beat is, but the motor control is really so poor that when he did a little lateral move with his head, he nearly knocked himself over. He's just very, very young in terms of motor control. But at the other end of life, that kind of innate capacity that should be educated, should be developed like any other important human skill, can be very important when it comes to rehabilitation. So this should go. Here we go. You're going to see a man with a stroke with brain damage that's paralyzed one half of his body. He had 3 weeks of traditional physical therapy and he wasn't doing any better in his walking with a cane. So this is when music therapy was first on board at Spalding, and they said, what the heck, let's try it. So what you see is the right-sided paralysis, both in the arm and in the leg, and instead of being a biped, he now has to be a triped with a cane. This is a closer look. It's a much smaller stride length than he normally would because of the right-sided paralysis. And all we're going to use here are 2 chords, to see whether we can get him walking better with music than without. And he did. He was able to entrain, just like we could see in the child models. And now he's walking without a cane. So we want to always see how they walk with music versus without. And this is how he looks at the end of one single neurologic music therapy session. So when we look at this, the results here, he started with a cane at 65 beats per minute and then nearly doubled that. He began at a distance of 40 feet and ended up at 250 feet. And I would ask you, if you ever went to an exercise class, to a Zumba, and the speakers were broken, would you stay? Would you do this without no, music organizes our movement behavior. It actually optimizes it and extends our greatest effort. Think of the difference between music you love and music you really don't love. You would work a lot harder. So even just 2 chords is going to bring George into walking far better than he could with the stroke and the physical therapy. And again, you'll get a pre and post to have the full appreciation. But because this child can do this, George can do that. As an elder, well, not quite an older, he was in his 60s. That's how he looks after one 45-minute session. It's okay to say, wow. I always like that in my sessions. So what music has become the hottest thing in neuroscience. As one neuroscientist told me, they feel it will help explain the brain in general, more so than anything else they've studied. And music has always been looked at educationally and in society at large as sort of ancillary, as optional. And Steven Pinker, the well-known linguist at Harvard now, called it auditory cheesecake. That we don't need cheesecake, and it could actually leave our species, and we'd be no different for it. So anytime you go to a music and neuroscience conference, there's always a reference to auditory cheesecake. So now you're in on it. And there's also been a great surge following the initial research known as the Mozart Effect that was published in 1992. But since the research could never be replicated, it was not validated and it was given a requiem. But still it persists that music could make you smarter. And if that were the case, I've listened to enough Mozart that I would be a Mensa member, but that's not been the case. And thank you. So if you think about it, why would any music that washed over us actually have the capacity to change our brains? Would listening to a tape of a second language actually change your brain to the point that you could rely on those changes in order to speak the language? No. So the Mozart Effect was given a requiem, and yet it still persists. In fact, the people who ask me this question the most are physicians who still are embroiled in that. But what we know is it's not the passive listening to anything, but it's the active doing that changes the brain in such remarkable ways. And because of that, neuroscience is very much involved with looking at the brain in perception and production of music. And what we know is that a musician's brain actually anatomically and physiologically looks and works differently than a non-musician's brain. And what's lovely is that they haven't studied accountants or attorneys or anything like that because of the difference of music. First off, perception is happening in the womb. Training can begin as young as 3 years of age. As little as 20 minutes of motor training can actually change the brain in measurable, perceptible ways. Now, what's really important for every child in the school district to have a good music education will be for those non-music benefits. But when we process just sound, whether it's the snowplow coming down the street or an ambulance sound, whatever the sound is, we involve thinking, feeling, and hearing. But when it comes to music, that's all really amplified. So after decades of studying visual processing, which happens in the back of the brain, voluntary movement, which happens about here, speech production here, Language comprehension here, there is no place I can point that is relegated as a music center. The entire brain, left and right, upper cortex and subcortex, is involved in the making of music. And in the language of Nina Kraus, who's my favorite neuroscientist, it's a bloody jackpot. So what we know from musicians' brains is they, as you would guess, would have highly developed sensory processing. But if you look, it's not just for sound, it's also for visual, tactile, and kinesthetic. So it involves all the major sensory systems, aside from smell. But the auditory processing is really fast, is really important, and you'll see the difference that that makes in language development of children, in literacy development. Of course, there's fine motor skill learning, which you would expect, but it's the link up between the sensory motor systems that's so key. Excuse me, I'm overcoming a really bad cold. The auditory motor system is so linked, is so powerful, that it was a violation of this that allowed the FBI to identify the Tsarnaev brothers as the perpetrators of the crime in Boston. They didn't know who they were looking for when they looked through all the films, but what they saw was those two young men didn't run at the sound of the bombs because they knew they were coming. And because they violated this auditory motor link-up, that was when they first began to identify them, back up the films, and see them dropping the backpacks. Now, as a cognitive therapist, one of the things I think is most important about music training is the influence on executive functions. And I think this is really important in working with nature, the biological nature of executive function development, to optimizing them. And attentiveness is really key. Attention is the bedrock of all cognition. You will not process, you will not remember anything unless you pay attention. And music is really key for that. I can walk into a room full of very enthusiastic college students, not in a 9 a.m. class, but usually the later ones. And in order to get their attention, I could do the usual, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna, all I do is go, boo, and everybody starts to look around and they sit down. Music gets your attention. And it gets it in a really sustained way. Music is temporal, and attention is temporal. It's time-based, so it holds your attention for really long periods. And when you see that in children's films, that's really notable. Emotional processing, of course, is a wonderful way to better be able to understand emotions, particularly those on the spectrum, for example, have an easier way of externalizing emotions through music as a way of learning to internalizing them. And memory capacity is also very strong. And then the social cognition, the interrelationship of working in a group is key. Excuse me. So here are some of the benefits of music training. One is that you get to hear speech and noise better. This is key. What they're seeing with elders who have hearing disabilities, that those elders who are musicians hear better than elders who were not musicians and had the same level of hearing acuity, even if the musician elders haven't played for decades. The auditory training that happens through music training allows them to avoid hearing aids and other types of things that are compensatory but not satisfying, not satisfactory at all. And because when people start to have hearing loss, they tend to be more socially isolated, which impacts their cognition, which then becomes very taxing in the healthcare system. So aging well is all about having cognition and social connection, and hearing is critical to that. This is a huge lifelong advantage to having music training. Also, auditory attention and memory across the lifespan is key. I play in a swing band, and there have been two musicians, two saxophone players in my section along with me that have had Alzheimer's disease. One had Pick's disease with Parkinson's, the other had Alzheimer's. They played through mid-stage Alzheimer's. They were still able, the auditory processing and the memory and attention to it. But here's the thing I never saw coming down the road, that if you were musically competent, Your literacy would reflect that. We can do tests with children at 3 years of age. We can do discriminatory tests. Is this the same or different? You know, do, 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 do. Same or different. If a child doesn't say, at least with 60% accuracy, the discrimination test, the likelihood they will have dyslexia is much higher. Now think about that. By the time we diagnose dyslexia, children are at least 2 years behind. And what it does to their self-esteem is high. And you see a lot of dyslexic children who are dropouts, drug abuse, etc. And here we now have a way of looking at auditory capacity that we can identify through music that will influence reading skills. And that learning to synchronize to a beat rhythmically actually will enhance literacy, and we can see that as all the way into high school. Does anybody think that's terrific? I really think that's just remarkable. And again, I never saw it coming. This is the work of Nadine Gabb at Children's Hospital, primarily. And what we see is that music is an equal opportunity support system. That for people who are at risk in adolescence, by studying music, they too can have a leg up in their education and their advancement. Of course, music therapy has always been used in special education, and it has the great ability to work in the domains of cognition, speech and language, and movement. And the purpose of music therapy is very, very different than music education. We don't care whether you play an instrument, we don't care whether you sing on pitch. We care that you sing, we care that you play, and we create instruments that are accessible for all kinds of people, quadriplegics, paraplegics, whatever. But the purpose of music therapy is non-music based. So we're looking at goals in speech and language. We're looking at IEP goals to see whether those can be achieved better through music than without. So for decades, I've worked with children on the spectrum, and what I noticed repeatedly is they responded to sung cues versus spoken cues. They were much more compliant, much more in touch with commands when they were sung versus when they were spoken. And what we now see is some early evidence as to why that would be through neuroscience, that their right hemisphere, which is typically related to melody perception, is much thicker in certain structures, and that may be why the world's savants are all autistic. They understand music so easily, even though speech and language can be very, very much behind, and social connections very much behind. They are just phenomenal for music. And if you've never seen Derek Paravicini or Rex Clack, they are marvelous to see. So when I was first trained in music therapy, it was a social sciences. Our goals were self-actualization, our goals were self-expression, but nobody pays to make people happy anymore. And we now, in evidence-based practices, absolutely, and understand the power and beauty of music through neuroscience, which is what led me back into music education, because we all deserve the right to have a proper music education from K through 12. The nice thing about this is the more you play, the more gains that you make in attention, working memory, hearing, speech and noise, and neural sound processing right across the lifespan. And there are studies that for aging well, so that people have less incidences of depression and acute care. And for those people, they've been learning how to play piano in their 70s. And for anybody who's tried to play piano as an adult, you know that ship has basically sailed. But if you learned it as a child, you would have this groundwork, this groundswell in which to connect. So I had a friend who had music as an avocation. Bill Woodcraft was a scientist in radar technology through World War II, and he also taught Leonard Bernstein how to play four-hand jazz at Harvard in 1939. But Bill, as he aged, he had prostate cancer, he had a heart attack, he had COPD. And I would accompany him to the Sherborne Inn on Tuesday nights, and he'd kind of go in a shuffle, you know, and we'd get in, and people say, "Oh, Bill, you gonna play tonight?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna play tonight." And so his life was lived as an elder's often is, with a lot of appointments with doctors. But then here was this whole other piece, and those of us who knew Bill knew that he lived many years longer, probably because he was a musician. And when his home care team came, I said, listen, if they're supposed to come at 10, at 11:45 you start playing piano. So when they come in, they see you as more than this man with this list of diagnoses. And as predicted, they stayed longer. They got to enjoy Bill and see what he could do. So across his entire life, he was able to play music as an avocation, and the quality of his life was greatly enhanced, as it is for elders. So here's a great example of aging well. I hope you all have seen this film. If not, rush out to the library. There are multiple copies. Joe has had 4 bouts of cancer treatment, 4 bouts of chemotherapy.
Is it getting better? Or do you feel the same? Will it make it easier on you now? You got someone to blame. You say, one love, one life. Well, it's one need. One love, we get to share it. If you need it, baby, if you don't care.
Average age of the choir is 77, depending on who's in it. They travel the world with a doctor, and they sing rock and roll and punk music. This is the Young at Heart Choir. To do that. I love him. So the film is called Young at Heart, and they came to the Berkeley Performance Center and they booked 2 nights. They were so wildly popular they had to do 3. And they traveled the world, and where there's a lot of things that Joe could no longer do as a long-term cancer patient with breathing compromise, but he could do that, and that's really exciting. And the social affiliation amongst the choir is really key. And then this I will let play the whole time. I want you to see not only is music innate, but it's long-lasting and robust against diseases and disorders.
When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson? Hello? You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who was in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. You're crying. Crying, you have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You don't want me to touch you. You're very sad. Can you see me? Is it scary? Are you afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down there's a need there. There's a little tear that's coming out. Do you feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson for the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches her child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up, and every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? You think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church songs. Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. What I did was, when she moved, I moved with her. And when I was singing, because she didn't sing with me, so I matched the intensity of my voice to the intensity of her movement. And pretty soon, for a split second, we became one person. Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. So at one point, when she got very quiet and very peaceful, and my voice became very quiet as hers and very peaceful, and my breathing slowed to her breathing, she pulled me to her, and I moved with her. And for her, at that moment, I believe I was a symbol of her mom. Can you open your eyes now? Do you see me? Feel safe and warm? Yes? Can you see? He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. A person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying, and you keep centering yourself, and really look at that person, and really mirror their movements, maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe? You feel safe? With Jesus? And me?
Now, if you've seen Alive Inside with Henry, who reacted to the music and becomes lucid, even though this is a beautiful example of love and touch, what the real bridge is oftentimes music that helps reorder brain function. This is an everyday experience for a music therapist in a nursing home or assisted living. But I want to be clear that in music education, it matters how you sing. At Berkeley, if you're going to try to audition for Berkeley, it matters how you sing, but for everything else, it doesn't matter how you sing. That was not a great vocal model, but it was enough. It just matters that you sing. And through this, we see over and over again people coming into lucidity because the music is so diffusely activated throughout the brain that Alzheimer's, strokes, Parkinson's does not deteriorate music capacity for perception or production. This is not an unusual event whatsoever, but it will be unless people do not have music exposure and music education throughout their life. We will not be able to reach them at the end in this way, and that concerns me greatly. Another point that I want to make is stress biology is one of the specializations that I've created out of my neuroscience work. And looking at the issues with youth now and stress, it's very, very much concerning. And from the Henry Benson Institute at MGH that's been studying the relaxation response for decades, what they say now is that over 90% of all medical office visits in this country are stress-related. And that's really remarkable. If that was a virus, we would all be calling it a pandemic. And it's time to really start to turn this boat around. I see when the students get to college, how many people now, even in the 10 years that I've been at Berkeley, the rapid increase in people who have diagnosed with anxiety disorders, who are medicated for anxiety disorders, and those who aren't formally are self-medicating. It is rampant, it is huge. And sleep deprivation has become a norm out of high school. And if you look, United States is #1 with sleep deprivation in children aged 9 to 10. They no longer know how to sleep. In fact, recently there was a student who was suggesting that the practice rooms be open from midnight to 8 a.m. And in fact, the recording studios at Berkeley are open from midnight to 8 a.m. And because of this research, I would assert that that's educational malpractice, to only give access students to those valuable resources for promoting their artistry and developing their artistry through the night, and they're expected to go to classes the next day. And I see them all the time come in and try to just have their seat. I think that stress is something that concerns me greatly. And we all ubiquitously use music as a way for stress reduction. And I would wager if I asked each of you, you could tell me the kind of music that you listen to when you're really looking to come down. I think this is something that can and should be a part of music education, that you're either composing pieces, improvising pieces, or playing pre-composed music that puts you into a better place. For me, I know that it's the Mozart Clarinet Concerto. Every time I play that, I just am more at ease. So we're binary beings either operating in fight or flight or operating in rest and restoration. And music is a great way to switch from one to the other. In the Benson Henry Institute for Relaxation Response, they use meditation and mindfulness. But honestly, that is really more challenging. That would be lovely if all of that was embedded. But music is that almost like a quick fix. And if you've just been diagnosed with cancer, for example, that's no time to learn to meditate. But it's music that can bring you to a place of restoration where you work with the medicine better than if your body is full of the toxicity of the stress response. Music is also a great way to release frustration. It's really disconcerting in college how many people say they play video games to get out their anger. And I said, well, why are you so angry? Why? And there's really never an answer to that, but they're playing the Grand Theft Auto and running over nuns and just all this ghastly activity. I think that frustration and anger, the only thing that can really receive that is a drum. And that when you get to drumming and really start to enjoy that, you will eventually move out of banging the heck out of it because you'll hurt your hands, and just getting into a groove. And now that's being brought into hospitals now for the staff so that they can come together as a community and have this type of experience, because stress is the #1 issue with nurses across the country. It's really very difficult because they're not staying in their jobs, they're not able to stay in their jobs, they have all kinds of disease processes. And so you get this marvelous sense of community. If any of you have ever had a drumming event, you do not need to know how to be a drummer. And we've been talking about doing some of those events with the Solar Jazz Festival too. But how do we address some of the psychosocial issues that have come up in this generation? For example, the teen suicide issue is tremendous. So I've been involved with a program down in Virginia, in Loudoun County, which has the #1 suicide rate amongst teens. These high-performing children just outside of DC. And so a 50-minute rock opera production, A Will to Survive, was created and debuted almost 2 years ago.
Shows me that I have to come out and be surrounded by people who care.
This show is about hope, and if we can help one person realize they are loved and that they are worthy of being on this earth, then the show will be worth it.
College applications, graduate convocations, I need vacation, never feel good enough, I'm a loser, not normal, a loser. Wish I was smarter, wish I was smarter. Invisible to everyone, they think I'm a loser, not normal, a loser.
This show is about reconnecting with an old friend and making sure his story is told.
Because my friend, you are the best. You are the best. Ooh. How many stars do you think are up there?
Oh, I don't have a clue. There are way too many to count.
Why do people always say you should wish upon a star?
Well, I guess you have to send your wishes somewhere, don't you?
It's amazing for me to be a part of it and to do it for her and for all the other people struggling out there with these similar issues.
A thin thread that holds me close to you.
It was her son that had committed suicide, and for her to be able to get on stage with all of us and trust us to deliver that message.
Wish I could be a pilot and fly forever until I find a place where my dreams are real. I want toys. I want to make noise.
Honestly, there is hope for people who feel these ways. I felt this way, and the show has given me hope.
I love you.
You do.
I love you.
This show to me means hope. It means relating to others and knowing that someone is there for you.
Suicide prevention, I mean, if we can get to one person, it can be everyone, and it potentially can be mind-blowingly amazing for Virginia, for America, for the world.
So that is Will's mother, who performs in it. It's been seen by over 20,000 school children in the past year and a half. Renee Fleming, the great opera star, hosted it at the Kennedy Center in December, and has been involved with having Anne Charlotte filmed so that the show will be licensed and sent out like any other type of production, Legally Blonde or Beauty and the Beast. But this is a way that we can address these really tender issues in a meaningful way. And in fact, my colleague went into the psych unit recently, and a young man said to him, I know you. You were that guy with that production, and I didn't kill myself because that song got stuck in my head. This is what can be possible. And these people on stage are not actors, they are actually clients of a place to be. One had Tourette's syndrome. One has chronic Lyme's disease. Other have various issues. They're not professionals. They didn't audition on talent. This really is this beautiful groundswell. And now Francis Collins, who's the director of NIH, has become involved in this production, as well as Renee Fleming in the work that they're doing. I also think that music can be an important way to help disseminate messages. So for my husband and I, our contribution to Northborough is through the Solar Jazz Festival, where we match cool green technology with red hot jazz. And so around the solstice will be our third annual. And we have an electric car meet. We have all kinds of educational resources about renewable technology. We had 6 bands for free. We had the Algonquin High School Jazz Band. And here's an opportunity to look at how music can impact in the way, Greg, that Daniel Pink would think. This is not the one. 1 sec. Sorry, it is not the one I meant. But music in society is a very important opportunity for musicians to make a difference, and I speak about it all the time. Yes, we can be entertaining, but I think that we can be so much more than that because we have the mic. And so how will we be responsible with that microphone? So I'm going to look for Song for a Warming Planet. Sorry, I had put the wrong one in.
I was in a class with Professor Scott St. George in the geography department, and at one point he posted a slide advertising for interns in his dendrochronology lab, and I was lucky enough to get that job. He came to me with a set of data with the task of turning it into a piece of music, and we wound up with a song of our warming planet. In the piece of music, each note will correspond to a year, and then the pitch of that note will represent the temperature of that year. So then these really high pitches, that would mean a warmer year, and then the lower pitches would be a cooler year. Data comes from the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA. It's a compilation of global annual surface air temperatures. Climate scientists have a standard toolbox to communicate their data, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to add another tool to that toolbox, another way to communicate these ideas to the people who might get more out of this than out of maps, graphs, and numbers. Climate change is a defining issue of our generation, and it's still something that a lot of people don't fully understand. And what we're trying to do is to represent with the music sort of the immediacy and the importance that this issue has right now. And if we act on that, then maybe it won't be as much of an issue for the future.
The range of human hearing is 20,000 hertz. A long way from where that cello was when it left off. So again, music is temporal. It brings you into a process, a time-based process. Looking at graphs and figures not necessarily will do that unless you're asked to dig in deeper, but it's really quite unavoidable to have data that is played in that way. And my husband did an ode to the planet that included the ringing of the bells of First Parish downtown. So when it comes to societal issues like the bombing in Boston, Berkeley was shut down for a week because it was part of the crime scene. And my students were many of them very anxious. They're from all around the world. And I said, you know, the sneakers will get wet, and the letters will get wet, and the flowers will die. Go out and play music in the city of Boston. Nobody will ever forget coming upon somebody playing music on a corner. And on the day, just a couple of months after the bombing, when the 2 firefighters died from the firehouse right on Boylston Street, they were first responders at the marathon. They died there. Our students circled the building and sang to them. Because what else could you really say? When there are no words, there's that phrase that when there are no more words, music speaks. Here's an incident in Norway where the young man who killed 67 people had said that he did it because Norway was becoming heterogeneous, and he was against it. And he thought that there was one song, a Pete Seeger song, that was sung with children, and he blamed that song specifically in the testimony he gave. And so with one ukulele, one of every 4 citizens of Oslo came and sang that song around the courthouse with him in it. That was unavoidable. He had to have heard that. That's how they responded. Music gives us something powerful to do, something powerful to say at a time of terrific calamity. So the National Association for Music Education has as a mission statement to promote the understanding in music making by all. I think that's too limited. I think the scope of that is really too limited. I'd like to say, based on the scientific evidence, that we have an innate propensity for music, and it deserves to be educated and cultivated like any other skill that we're born with. Language, capacity, movement, absolutely. It matters across our entire lives. It's robust against diseases and disorders. We will not benefit from that unless we have a proper music education. I think people should be taught how to play an instrument, how to sing, how to be involved in music, so they know how to create joy and comfort in their own lives and in the lives of others across their lifespan. Yes, there are these beautiful advantages here in their brains, but I want to look at the bigger role that music can play. I don't think music education should be for the talented whatsoever. I do not think it should be a talentocracy, because honestly, anybody that wants to go to a music school is going to go whether they're being encouraged or not. Trust me, at least 90% of my students were dissuaded by somebody from getting an undergraduate music degree. They come anyway. We should not be looking to populate music schools just like we don't populate math-oriented schools like MIT. We really deserve to have every child have this education as the future parents of tomorrow, because the most important time for music education is the last trimester in the womb up to 7 years of age. Those are parents. And for junior high children to be doing compositional work, they could be doing play songs, they could be doing their own lullabies, and those simple compositions which would meet the standards there would help them be the best babysitter they can be, because they're the babysitters of today and the parents of tomorrow. They would know how to use music to help emotionally regulate another person. And what if we brought that to at-risk mothers? In low income, thankfully we're not in a low income school, but we do have people in need. What if people were able to better do that? My friend Eli Newberger, who started the first child abuse clinic at Children's Hospital in 1972, would say, you wouldn't shake a baby. You would know how to quiet a baby. You wouldn't neglect a baby. You would know how to connect with a baby through music. This is our inherited human right in my mind, and I think that everybody should play an instrument, whether they have talent or aptitude or not. We are certainly that way with all other subjects. And so I feel that strongly that music is a force for good in the world, and that we should wield that beautifully. So in summary, I do look at music now through a scientific lens and through evolutionary biology, which I didn't even touch tonight, in neonatology. What I've come to understand is music is an inherited human right. And again, it should be cultivated for that. There are many skills that are innate, and in fact, far more so than language. We have far more language incompetent people on the planet than we do music incompetent people, which is a condition known as amusia. Those who are truly tone deaf versus those who just need more support. And any music educator that asks somebody to just mouth the words, that they're not a good enough singer, I can't tell you how many people I've met that are so pained by that kind of a statement again. It doesn't belong in the education of children. That music training has beautiful non-musical skills because of the active engagement. And even if you no longer play, you still keep those gains decades later as you age. And I do believe that music calls us to do better and to be better as humans on the planet in whatever direction that we choose. Now, I've left time because I'm really interested in what you're interested in. And I figure adults are going to give me a lot better questions than 18 to 22-year-old students. So what interests you? What did you connect with? How was this for you? Questions? Yes?
Hi, Kathleen. It's Katrina.
Hey! Hello, darling.
I'm just wondering if there's any work out there in regards to what we might consider high-quality music or low-quality music. You know, does it matter if we're interacting with Mozart or Simon and Garfunkel? Is that not to imply that Paul Simon's not one of them?
He's a trustee at Berkeley, so we wouldn't want to go there.
I didn't know if there was any neurological research, you know, to point to a certain complication factor in music. The more complicated the music, is it more beneficial?
The more I listen to WCRB, I really realize how much weak, thin classical music is there, and I can hardly tolerate their programming. So I wouldn't say that, you know, everything that Mozart did was touched by the goddess herself. But the complexity of music should match what the intention is in the lesson plan and in the standards. And because of pop culture, the earlier you are using classical music, thick music. My husband played the Firebird Suite for our child when she was like 6 months old, which was, you know, was a pretty powerful piece. And now she spends her time listening to Chick Corea, and you know, she's got a real interesting taste in music at 14. So I think children don't need to have music dumbed down to them, and that the earlier you get them, before about the age of 11 or 12, when peer influences really start to come in with pop influences. I mean, Justin Timberlake was just pitiful last night. Where was the musicality? I mean, nothing was real. That's just one girl's opinion, but I think the complexity of music can be with any genre, and that the earlier you expose them to that, the more, you know, is the difference between giving them hearty bread versus white bread. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to see you. Any questions? Yes?
How much music education does it take to make a difference and to get some of the benefits we talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. How much? We really don't know how much, although we can see specifically with the anatomical changes in a child that those who started before the age of 7 have far thicker structures in the brain than those who began after 7. So again, that magic time is the final trimester up to 7. We know that for sure. But as far as how long it should go, definitely the younger children in middle school, it should be very heavily programmed. Perhaps connected with other subjects. History, of course, is a real natural, et cetera, et cetera. But in high school, kids are going to take off and go in the direction of that. I still say there should be an expectation that everybody play an instrument, and continue to pursue that, and having a variety of instruments also available versus what we've classically had, like ukulele and guitar, seems to draw in a lot of students too. Let's make sure that everybody finds a place. So we don't know that from a neuroscientific perspective, except for the little ones actually have the best advantage. And did you have a question? Yeah. No, oh, sorry, over here.
Yeah, so you had the classification musician and non-musician. I'm just wondering, folks who do not play music but love music, listen to music all the time, things like that, do they have another group, or they actually are just plain non-musician?
Well, since it's only 20 years old, they're really looking at musicians who are trained, but it's also very difficult to identify musicians per se. You would think it would be easy, but there are many musicians who come to Berkeley who never took a lesson in their life. They learn via YouTube. So if you use private lessons as a criterion, then they're not going to meet that. Many musicians didn't go to college for music, and they're marvelous musicians, and so you couldn't use that as a criterion. So we use levels of aptitude in that regard. We do have many studies where people are just listening to music versus producing, and the changes are gradated for those who are actually producing. They get the most bang for their buck. Yes?
I am curious, obviously being a proponent of more music education, how difficult has that become for you in today's society when music has become so devalued? And what I mean by that is either people just don't pay for it, or they don't buy an album anymore like they used to. They just go online and pay 99 cents, if that. So music now has just become so cheap and devalued. I'm just curious, does that make it a harder sell?
I don't think for music education and music therapy as much as it does music business and performance. It's a whole new industry for sure. Not that the old industry of getting contracts was ever very good, because so many musicians got really screwed. And in fact, there's a documentary of Tom Petty right now and his big fight for the music that he wrote and not owning it. So it has changed it a lot. It's also made it more accessible to people. You can have GarageBand and you can be doing your own thing. And so there are goods in, there are pluses and cons against all of it. But in music education, in music therapy, I think when we were beholden to a social science context in which to validate our work, that was very, very difficult. But now that it's neuroscience, I feel like I'm on terra firma. I really do. Yes. Hi.
My question is, as a music teacher, you mentioned that you don't, kids respond to the beat, you don't have to teach the beat, but my experience in the classroom is that, I'd say half, if not 75%, don't come in necessarily moving rhythmically. So my question is, do they lose that, or is that social in nature that they don't move rhythmically in a classroom environment? Or?
It's a very good question. I think that we would really want to look at how much musicking was that child involved with before they came to you. Like anything, it will be pruned unless it's used. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. They're still in a beautiful window where that can come back online. And that's where the wonderful work of ORF, I think, is really helpful, and Edwin Gordon's practices are helpful. And letting them experience it in as many different ways, in their hands and their feet, so that they can finally get that. But a lot of it, too, is motor coordination and the ability to match your intention with motor coordination. And that can be really hard. Like, it's not until the end of kindergarten, but we know that kids can skip reliably. So it informs music education programming. So there's a lot of motor coordination still left online. Anything else? Oh, come on, I could do this for 8 more hours. I have so many films of cute kid videos. Oh, my Lord. I could keep us going. But I do, yes?
So you talked about music being a whole brain experience, but is there any aspect, just like the harmonies or the rhythm, that's localized in the brain? And could that be used to target specific therapies for specific groups?
Well, when I teach music therapy, I teach using the right element of music to get the right outcome. So when it came to George walking, we didn't need harmony and we didn't need melody. It only took 2 chords to actually get him moving better, far better. And that's because music is a brain-based intervention for a brain-based disorder. His legs never had the stroke, it was his brain. So the signals weren't getting there, and this freed up the signals. We also see it with Parkinson's. So the right element for the right occasion, we know something about some of the localization, rhythm being the most powerful element we wield, being the most subcortical, and yet on both hemispheres of the brain. So that is the most powerful thing we do by far. But if you were going to have George now 3 months down the road still working on his rehabilitation, you were going to have to pull out all the stops. Familiar music, unfamiliar music, thick harmonies, clear, strong beats, probably just send him off with the Talking Heads and he'd be good to go for 3 months. But that's where the complexity of music is going to keep him moving. Because with strokes, it's a very, very slow process. We know that people are making changes in the brain and to their behaviors 10 years out from a stroke now. We used to say, we'll give you a year. And whatever you get in a year, that's what you get. That's not the case. It's 10 years. So how do you keep people moving and working? I work with a stroke patient who now is 2 years this month following his stroke, and he's starting to get some pain in his hand, which has been non-functional, which is a possible sign of return of function. 2 years, he's had absolutely nothing. He's had to pick and carry this up all the time. So these changes really require the vast complexity and simplicity that we can offer in music to keep people persisting and working. Yeah. So I have cards up here if anybody's interested in continuing this conversation. I warmly welcome you to the Solar Jazz Festival that will happen this summer. And we're looking to give a scholarship to an Algonquin graduate that is looking at both art and science for their pursuits. And I welcome any recommendations for those children as well. But I also really want, if you are a music educator, would you please raise your hand? And our thanks go to you, the noble work that you do every day.